Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for the first Kennedys, the humble roots of an American dynasty. We're joined by author Neal Thompson, who's going to discuss his brand new book, The First Kennedys. We're going to explore the inspiring story of the poor Irish refugee couple who escaped famine, created a life together in a city hostile to the Irish immigrants and Catholics, and launched the Kennedy dynasty in America. Their Irish ancestry was a hallmark of the Kennedys' initial political profile, as JFK leveraged his working class roots to connect with blue-collar voters. Today, we remember the iconic American family as the vanguard of wealth, power, and style, rather than the descendants of poor immigrants. So we're going to meet the first American Kennedys, Patrick and Bridget, who arrived, as many thousands of others did, following the Great Famine. They were penniless and hungry. Less than a decade after their marriage in Boston, Patrick's sudden death left Bridget to raise their children single-handedly. Her rise from housemaid to shop owner in the face of rampant poverty and discrimination kept her family intact, allowing her only son, PJ, to become a successful saloon owner and businessman. PJ went on to become the first American Kennedy elected to public office, the first of many. So Neal Thompson is a journalist and the author of 5 highly acclaimed books, including A Curious Man, Driving with the Devil, and the memoir Kickflip Boys. A former newspaper reporter, he has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Esquire, Outside, Men's Health, Vanity Fair, the Wall Street Journal, and many more. Neal has appeared on NPR, PBS, The Daily Show, CNN, Fox, TNT, the History Channel, and ESPN. And he lives in Seattle with his family. So let's give a big virtual Massachusetts round of applause to Neal for joining us this evening. And Neal, why don't you take a bow, Neal?
I'm in a cramped space, so I can't really bow. I'm in a hotel room in Scranton, Pennsylvania. So that's the best I can do.
Well, thank you, Neal, for joining us on the road. So Neal is doing both a virtual book tour and a physical in-person book tour around the country. We appreciate him giving us some of his time this evening. We appreciate it, Neal.
And I just want to say before we get started, Robert, thank you so much for having me. This is great. I am a lifelong library attendee, fanboy. As a researcher, writer, nonfiction writer, I rely on libraries for so much, and it's been hard the past couple of years to not be able to visit my local library in Seattle and to visit, not to be able to visit other libraries for research for my next book. And even at the tail end of the Kennedy's book, I was prevented from getting out and about. So you and I were talking before we got started. It's so great that things are finally starting to open up. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Robert, for doing this. I think it's great that it's a group of Massachusetts libraries that are part of this event and other events like it. And it just means so much to authors to be able to connect with readers and in particular connect with librarians. So thank you, Robert. Thank you, Tewksbury, and thank you all for joining us tonight.
Yeah, absolutely, Neal. And Neal, we're fortunate in Massachusetts to have the Boston Public Library, which is arguably the best, if not one of the best public libraries in the country. But you in Seattle also have one of the better public libraries. So that's great that you can take advantage of that. All right, so why don't we jump right in, Neal? And these first couple of questions, I think, are good introductory questions to get the audience familiar with the book. So when your newspaper dispatched you to cover the disappearance and death of JFK Jr. Back in 1999, one bartender cried to you that she, quote, felt like I just lost a family member, unquote. So what is it about the Kennedy family, so fabled and remote in many ways, that has cultivated such familiarity and fondness?
Yeah, that's a good way to start, because it's in fact something that I talk about in the opening pages of the book. I'll start, Robert, by just explaining a little bit about me, my background. I grew up in a very Irish Catholic community, right? Like I attended 16 years of Catholic school in northern New Jersey. I know, and in fact, I'm in Scranton now because I'm giving a talk at the University of Scranton, which is my alma mater, which is actually my last 4 4.5 maybe years of Catholic education. But I was surrounded by, other Irish kids, very Catholic community, and but I never necessarily, growing up, had this affinity for the Kennedy family, or this, obsession or passion for them. I grew up with other families who did have a bust of JFK on the mantle, and revered that family. I appreciated what they represented. As someone who had a sister with Down syndrome, I appreciated that the Kennedys were involved in creating the Special Olympics, but I never, I don't know, I never got caught up in the mythology of it. That moment that you referenced, that moment when JFK Jr. was killed, I was working for the Baltimore Sun newspaper. They sent me north from there to Hyannisport, where I was part of that mass of reporters covering the subsequent death of JFK Jr. And something clicked that day, both being there and seeing how much he meant to people and how upset they were, like the bartender you mentioned. But then afterwards, after I left Hyannisport and drove back south toward Baltimore, I passed through my home state of New Jersey and realized I'm within a couple miles of my Irish immigrant grandparents, both dead at that time, buried in a cemetery not far from the New Jersey Turnpike. And something just kind of went, and I wanted from that point forward to know a little bit more about where I came from. I knew I was Irish, half Irish on my mother's side. But I wanted to know more. I knew the Kennedys came from Ireland. I came from Ireland. I wanted to explore, what does that mean? And ultimately, it took a lot of false starts for this book, a lot of fits and starts before I figured out, I want to find out who came to America first, of that iconic family that has eventually meant so much to us. Where did it begin? What was their life like in Ireland? Why did they come to America? What was life like when they got here? And really tell the backstory, or kind of the prelude or the prologue, the 19th century prologue to the 20th century Kennedys that we think of today. And so that's what started me on that journey. And again, many fits and starts, 20 plus years later, I finally finished this book. But the goal was to bring to life, again, like it says in the title, the first Kennedys. Who was first, and how did we treat them when they got here?
So lots of, including Tewksbury, lots of libraries have genealogy clubs and groups and seminars and workshops. And so I'm curious. So the first two Kennedys to set foot on American soil had some pretty common names: Patrick Kennedy and Bridget Murphy. So how did you overcome the challenges posed by tracking such run-of-the-mill names across an ocean and a century and a half?
Excellent question. Yeah, I'm sure there's some either genealogists or those who have done that kind of work joining us tonight, and can imagine the challenges of trying to both in libraries and online try and learn more about Patrick Kennedy and Bridget Murphy. It was tricky, and I try to be very honest in this book. Here's what I know, and here's what I don't know. What we know is that Patrick and Bridget grew up on two separate farms in County Wexford in the southeast of Ireland, came to America during the potato famine that just devastated that country, and made a life for themselves in America. Married in 1849, started to raise a family, had a few kids, lost their first son. A lot of this is traceable through genealogical records and newspaper stories from the day, and ship manifests, passenger lists, these kinds of things that remarkably there's so much online now. I didn't realize since my last book how much has been digitized and is accessible. But you're right, Robert, like there were so many times I would look at a list of passengers on a certain ship and get excited at seeing Patrick Kennedy's name, but think, do I know that's him? Is it? Do we know for sure? And in the past, many Kennedy books have just kind of accepted as the norm, like, yep, the Washington Irving is the ship that Patrick was on. There's less that's been written about Bridget, so there wasn't even an attempt at guessing which ship was hers. But you're right, it created a lot of challenges and required other types of sort of investigative research on my part, and I felt like I was trying to solve this mystery, and I think I got close. I think there are things that we'll never know. Bridget did not leave a diary behind. She did not leave her collected papers behind. We don't know what she was thinking as she was, standing on the ship of whichever ship she was, standing on the deck of her ship, coming into Boston, having left her entire family behind. But we do have, thanks to libraries and archives, other letters and diaries and recollections of what it was like for other poor, terrified Irish immigrants coming to America. And so I relied heavily on those kinds of resources to sort of build the world around Bridget and Patrick, even during those moments when I didn't know exactly what their specific experience was like.
And can you give us a brief history lesson of the sort of Great Irish Potato Famine, and who was to blame for it, and sort of what caused the situation?
Yeah, definitely. And apologies in advance to any Brits who might be watching. It's a long time ago, so take it. But, the potato famine occurred in the 1840s, started 1845, got worse in 1846 and 47. At the time, the Irish were colonists. They were part of a British colony, they wouldn't view themselves as colonists. They would view themselves as, poor tenants of absentee English landlords. Ireland had been conquered by England centuries before. So when we meet Bridget and Patrick, they are living on small farms, kind of peasant life. Life as it had been for not just decades, but maybe centuries, because they had not been given the opportunity to thrive on their own land. They didn't own their own land. Most Irish people rented land back from these English landowners, many of whom lived far away. And so they were already in a very tenuous position, and very poor and very reliant on agriculture. When the potato famine hit and devastated the potato crops, it mainly affected the Irish because that's what they lived on. Potatoes were cheap to grow and nourish, had enough nourishment that many Irish relied mostly on potatoes for their sustenance. And then their other crops were sold to pay for the rent. So when the potato famine devastates this one crop that was such a big part of the Irish diet, things were thrown into turmoil, and tenant farmers could either eat the crops that they were selling to pay their rent and then face eviction, or, in many cases, folks just left. I describe it, it was one of the first mass migrations of one population of people at any one tight period of time. These were refugees, running like a house on fire from a crumbling homeland. And there's Bridget who decides to leave home alone, like many Irish women did. Many of the immigrants who came to America were women. They outnumbered the men, which was kind of remarkable. So the situation at home wasn't great. Then they escape to America and find it's not so great there either.
Right. So let me ask you about that. You make the interesting point that Bostonians were willing to send food and money to the starving Irish, during the famine, but they didn't want them to actually come into their own neighborhoods and seek a new life in America. So I'm wondering, can you talk a bit about how Irish Catholics were received in Boston at the time?
Yeah, I was shocked, I guess, to learn just how poorly they were received in Boston and other countries. I focus obviously on Boston because that's where the Kennedys ended up. But I knew in broad brushstrokes that we were a nation that claimed to welcome immigrants with open arms, and that wasn't always the case. And I, again, broadly knew that the Irish were discriminated against and feared at that time. But as I dug deeper into this story and found evidence of, specifically how they were treated day in and day out by neighbors and others, it was terrifying. They came here with nothing, hoping to start a new life, and then you've got mobs of anti-immigrant, so in some cases thugs, saying, go back to where you came from. Don't bring your crime here. Don't bring your religion here. Send them back. Some of these sentiments that we've heard again in recent years. And so in the book, I really do try and explore how back then the Kennedys heard some of the same, violent, angry shouts to go back where they came from that immigrants in recent years have heard, in the same ways. I described the Know Nothing Party, for example, political parties that were created through much of the 1800s, specifically to either keep out or keep down immigrants, specifically at that time, Irish and Catholic, because they were the first big wave of immigrants coming to America. So you had politicians, some of them well-respected. You had preachers, some of them well-respected, saying, the Catholics are just coming, like conspiracy theories, like coming here to take over the country. They're trying to, install the Pope as the leader of this land. We've got to send them back. We've got to prevent them from becoming citizens, prevent them from voting, prevent them from, doing much of anything. In the opening pages of the book, I describe how Bridget loses her son in the 1850s, loses her husband 10 years after they made it to America. She can't even bury her own family within Boston city limits because there are laws to prevent Catholics from burying their dead in Boston. We think of Boston as such an Irish Catholic city now, but back then, 1850s, Bostonians were doing their best to prevent it from becoming Irish or Catholic.
By the way, you referenced the Know Nothings. Can you also briefly talk about the wide awakes that you referenced in the book as well?
Yeah, I describe a bunch of different groups that I hadn't heard of previously before researching this. They're two different, well, I guess they're multiple versions of the wide awakes. I think they show up later doing similar stuff, like making it hard for people trying to make it in America. But the period that I write about, 1850s into the 60s, and even going back before that, the wide awakes were, sort of working class, mostly Protestant young men who feared the Catholics and feared the Irish and organized around that fear, and did what they could to terrorize many of the Irish who were just trying to live their lives in these crappy neighborhoods, slums in Boston and Philly and New York and New Orleans and Pittsburgh and elsewhere, Chicago. But these gangs, the wide awakes was one group. They would shout, they would protest through some Irish neighborhood and chant and scream wide awake, and send them back. And they were sort of the muscle working alongside the Know Nothing Party and other groups. They had their own newspapers that were just focused on anti-Catholic sentiments and anti-Catholic conspiracy theories. So it was a hard life when the Kennedys got here. They were up against a lot of very aggressive and violent attitudes that didn't want them to thrive in this new land that they had chosen.
So you referenced how some politicians took advantage of the presence of the Irish. And even beyond politicians, though, you reference lots of famous folks in the book, like Henry David Thoreau, who, on the one hand, supported abolition, but on the other hand, was very anti-Irish immigrants and called them guilty of filth and folly. So can you kind of reconcile those two things in our minds?
Yeah, it's hard to reconcile it. I found it fascinating that folks like Thoreau, and I mentioned preachers like Lyman Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's father or grandfather, sorry,
Father.
but would preach on the one hand against slavery, right? So very forward thinking on the one hand, but when they were asked about Irish and Catholics, they hated them and they wanted to keep them down. So these attitudes were very much in conflict. I described Samuel Morse, creator of the telegraph, or co-creator of Morse code. He wrote a wildly popular book in the 1830s about the Catholic conspiracy and the threat of these foreign influences like the Irish and Catholics. He was a Know Nothing member, or actually his party was called the Native American Party, which says a lot about where their heads were at. And in fact, there's evidence that when he created his dots and dashes, one use that he envisioned was to use that secret code to prevent the Catholics from taking over, the White House or whatever other, goals they were aspiring to. It was just nonsense. Many of these groups had secret handshakes, and sort of they were like, I describe them in the book as little boys pretending to be, spies up against an enemy that wasn't an enemy. They were just poor people trying to start anew after their country fell apart. And it's stating the obvious, but it's hard not to make parallels to how we've treated other immigrant populations across time.
Before we move on to PJ, I did want to mention, I thought it was interesting. Can you tell us the name Bridget, what the name Bridget means for folks in Ireland, and what Bridget came to mean for folks in America?
Yeah, we talked earlier how it's such a common name in Ireland. And one reason for that is that Bridgets are named for Saint Bridget of Ireland. There are different origin stories of Saint Bridget. She sort of dates way back to sort of this mythology, mythical figure, but over time she's just been adopted as one of the primary, patron saints of Ireland and many other things. So you've got Saint Bridget, you've got Saint Patrick, and I think there's a third whose name I'm forgetting, but those are the two primary patron saints of Ireland. And she represented a lot to people across time, different things, but she's the patron saint of sailors. She's the patron saint of, the poor, all these things. Or St. Bridget wells across Ireland, these holy wells that people would, go dip their finger into and sign of the cross before they left for America, for example. So she is an important and revered historical / mythological figure in Ireland. Thus many girls were named Bridget across time. So in Ireland, she means this, power and empathy and all these positive things. When all of these Bridgets get to America, and I described the passenger list I would look at, just Bridget, Biddy, Bridie, all these variations of Bridget, one after the other on these passenger lists. They get to America, and as a group, because so many of them end up working in servitude as domestics, as servants, as maids, as a group, they collectively are referred to as Bridgets, maids, servants, the help. So this dangerous crossing to America, when they get here, even their name is changed to mean something that it wasn't supposed to mean. They're designated as poor Irish maids, and people would call maids my Bridget or my Biddy. A quick aside, I describe it later in the book. My Irish immigrant grandparents, Bridget and Patrick, when my grandmother came to America and she worked as a maid, she changed her name to Della because she didn't want to be known as a Bridget.
So, and I think I forgot to ask you this. How did Patrick and Bridget meet?
Probably through family, which was common. I describe how Patrick in Ireland was probably the first of his family to leave the family farm and ended up working in this little town of New Ross, north of his family farm, where he learned to make barrels, whiskey and beer barrels. So he had a skill. At that brewery, he met a man named Patrick Barron, who turns out to be related distantly to, or as a cousin of, not too distant, but a cousin of Bridget Murphy. As these different family members make it to America, Patrick Kennedy and Patrick Barron reconnect because they worked together. They both find work in America as coopers. So they have a little bit of a leg up. They don't have to work as ditch diggers or work in the railroads like many other Irish men did. So together they end up making barrels again in America. And I believe, but we don't know for certain, but it seems as if Patrick Barron introduced his cousin Bridget to Patrick Kennedy. They get married in 1849. They live in East Boston, just across the harbor from the North End. They start a family. I mentioned briefly earlier, they have eventually three daughters. First son, John F. Kennedy, dies at 20 months old. The life expectancy of kids, firstborn, American-born kids of Irish immigrants, at that time, life expectancy was 5 years. So John F. Kennedy doesn't even make it that long. And then 1858, Bridget and Patrick welcome a second son, PJ, youngest child after their three daughters. But at the time, Patrick Kennedy is sick of consumption, as tuberculosis was then known. And he ends up dying November 22nd, same day JFK would be assassinated many years later. And that date of his death leaves Bridget alone with 4 kids, working as a maid, widowed, and living in the slums of East Boston. So I apologize, Robert, I forget what your initial question was, but that moment has always stuck with me, and the book kind of opens with a version of that, because I feel like the Kennedy family could have ended right there, on November 22nd, with Patrick Kennedy dead and Bridget alone with her kids. So many widows lost their children to orphanages or gave them up, or the illnesses that were part of the just teeming around them could have taken her or any one of her kids, and that could have been the end of it. So the book is a testament to her tenacity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So folks, I'm going to give another 10 or 15 minutes of questions to Neal. So in the meantime, feel free to start getting questions into the Q&A. There's about 150 of you, so let's come up with some good questions. And I will start getting to the audience questions within the next 10 to 15 minutes. So let's transition now to the next generation with the PJ and the other children. So can you talk about the education that they received?
Yeah, not much. There were public schools in East Boston. PJ went to the Lyman School, which was the local public school. Overcrowded, not enough space for anybody. Teachers were overworked. But I described the dynamic there, which was many Irish kids learning alongside many of these Protestant Yankee kids. But the teachers and the headmasters were very focused on having a very Protestant focused and very English centric curriculum and religious studies. And this was a problem for many Irish families. Their children were forced to recite the Protestant version of the Lord's Prayer. Slightly different, but meaningful to the Irish. They were forced to study the King James Bible. Different, but in a meaningful way to the Irish. So there were a lot of protests among Irish parents saying, wait a second, can't we just all learn the same things? Why do you have to shove it in our face? A lot of the lessons that PJ and others were confronted with were very English centric. Describe Oliver Cromwell, the conqueror of Ireland, being taught as a hero of England. So there were protests. Irish kids got whipped if they didn't get with the program. And so at some point, PJ, because he's, doesn't have a father figure, his mother's busy working, and he ends up getting in trouble. He goes to, the detention center probably for truancy at one point. And I describe how from that low point for him, he emerges and kind of gets his act together and becomes a longshoreman, and in time becomes an incredible success in business and in politics.
Well, and let's talk about his business success. How does he go about becoming a saloon owner, and what role, if any, does Bridget play?
I think Bridget was crucial to PJ's eventual success. We talked earlier about Bridget working as a maid when she came to America, but she didn't stay there. She, over time, worked at a hotel in East Boston. She worked as a hairdresser at the Jordan Marsh department store in downtown Boston, and in time opened her own grocery store in East Boston, sometime around the end of the Civil War, and operated that shop a couple different locations until it found its like home base on Border Street in East Boston. Operated that for the rest of her life. So she was this rare and remarkable female business owner, widowed female business owner, widowed immigrant female business owner. Like, she had many strikes against her, and yet managed to succeed as a small business owner. Just incredibly rare. So it doesn't sound like much now, but for her to run her own business and in time to be so successful that she was able to buy the building where her grocery store existed, and then the building next to it, and become a landlord to other incoming Irish immigrants. She just became a remarkable success in a relatively short period of time, alone. She never remarried. She was raising her kids by herself. So she was a remarkable success story. So PJ, gets into trouble when he's young, but in time sort of taps into his own sense of entrepreneurship, and sort of there's also this sort of community mindedness in both their businesses. Bridget, stuck in the East Boston community from the day she got to America, and worked there and lived there, and got to, helped her neighbors. PJ similarly stayed most of his life and career in East Boston. So he opened, his first saloon was in South Boston. He sold that, and then he started buying saloons and opening retail liquor shops in East Boston. And I describe him as this type of bartender and saloon keeper who was always cognizant of the people around him, especially incoming immigrants and other neighbors who needed help. He was very, he was a very empathetic guy, a listener instead of a talker, is how I describe him. If somebody has just gotten to East Boston and they're a little lost and they're trying to find a job or a place to live, they would come to PJ's saloon, and he would connect them with a place to live or a place to get a job.
Yeah, and so as a follow-up to that, and you just touched on it, but can you delve a little deeper into how he sort of transitions from a barkeep to a successful democratic political operative? And you talked about how he didn't have certain political skills that you would associate with a politician. He was a bad public speaker. He was a bad campaigner, but yeah, he did seem to be successful in politics. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's this interesting transition for him and other men of his generation who were involved in the liquor business, which I think many Irishmen just decided this is a way to get a step up out of manual labor, away from the docks where it was hard work and dangerous work sometimes. Running a small business made sense, and there was no shortage of customers when you owned a saloon. But through that, he got to know the political leaders of East Boston and other parts of Boston. He got to know voters. He got to know neighbors. And in time, the ward leaders, he lived in East Boston, so he was Ward 2, ward leaders started to come to him and said, hey, maybe you can help us out with this event. Maybe you'd like to be on the fundraising committee for this, dance that we're trying to put together. Or maybe you'd like to start walking the streets just before election day and knock on some doors and tell people who to vote for. It was a fascinating time because not only do you see this slow rise of Irish business owners, in the case of the men, these saloons in many cases, but also the beginnings of Irish democratic politics in Boston. At the time of PJ's initiation into the world of politics, the city, the whole state it was run by old school families, almost entirely Republican, shouldn't say mostly, and very Protestant dominated. So the Irish were always trying to find a way to break through that ceiling, and PJ was part of that first wave. But you're right, he wasn't a great public speaker. He didn't love campaigning, but what he did do was made promises and kept them. He went out of his way to help. And anything that, once he got elected, he kind of skipped right over this city council and board of aldermen and got elected to the state legislature. He was a state representative and then a state senator, 7 years total in the state house. And many of the bills that he either put forth or at least supported were all about helping his East Boston, mostly immigrant community, a new ferry system or a tunnel to connect East Boston with Boston, help for the firefighters, pension support. He was always cognizant of the little guy. And I think some of that sensibility later trickles down into later generations of the Kennedys.
Speaking of later generations, we'll hit the fast forward button just a little bit. So in 1887, PJ marries a woman named Mary Hickey. And in 1888, they have their first child, who's Joseph Patrick, Joseph Kennedy. And it's interesting, you point out in the book, the Kennedys are like this amazing, successful immigrant story, they fulfilled the American dream situation. Yet interestingly, Joseph Kennedy throughout his life really downplays his immigrant roots. He's a second generation American, yet he really doesn't play up that fact. Can you speak on that? Why do you think that was the case?
Yeah, I think there were personal reasons for Joe, but also a dynamic in place that kind of made sense, and then Joe kind of ran with it. But I think his mother and father, Mary and PJ, as the American-born kids of Irish immigrants, appreciated where they came from, appreciated the hardships that their parents went through, make it to America and to start a family and to make a life for them. When Joe comes along, his father is a successful, wealthy guy. PJ, not only the political success, but he opens a bank and he gets involved in the coal business and real estate. So he's born, with a spoon in his mouth. He goes to Harvard because daddy can help him. He gets a job at a bank and becomes a very young bank president because daddy owned the bank. So in many ways, I think Joe was ready to become American. He didn't want to, wallow is not the right word, but he didn't want to linger in this place of, mythologizing where he came from and the old sod and the hardships we all went through. He would tell his children, we're American now. We're not Irish American. We're not hyphenized. We're American. I was born here. I'm an American. And that's the way his mind worked. He didn't really have any kind of sentimentality about where he came from. And I find it remarkable later, he gets named to be ambassador to the court of St. James, to ambassador to England, and is kneeling before the Queen of England, who his grandparents would have spat on the Queen of England if they had the opportunity, because they blamed her for everything bad that happened to their country. So a lot of interesting dynamics happening with Joe as he becomes hugely successful and then very politically engaged. But I think he didn't have time for, the old country. He wanted to succeed. He wanted his kids to succeed. I honestly think he thought of Ireland as a loser country, to be blunt. He wanted to be aligned with, America.
And the royal family, even nowadays, having their issues. So I'm going to hit the fast forward button even further. I'm going to try to. We skipped a bunch of things, but I'm going to try to tie things up here before I go to the audience Q&A. So this is a question. This was a suggested question. Exactly a century after his great-grandparents had left County Wexford, JFK toured the area and began to explore and embrace his Irish heritage. This later inspired him to write A Nation of Immigrants. How did JFK and the other Kennedys of his generation re-embrace the compassion for the poor, the unemployed, the disenfranchised, and the immigrant that seemed to leapfrog over their parents?
Yeah. I think that's a fascinating sort of, what's the word, flow of influences from Bridget to PJ to Joe. I think Joe's wife, Rose, had different views on both how to raise her kids and what mattered and what things to convey to her kids that she felt were important. So I think it's a complicated, sort of messy route to get to the JFK and RFK and their sisters and other siblings. But I think it is interesting that JFK embraced to an extent his Irish past. And I think it does say a lot about that family overall, that many of those siblings did acknowledge that there are others out there who need help, either from politicians or from nonprofits or groups like the Special Olympics later on. I think that those kids were raised with this sense of giving back. Even though Joe had these other ideas, wealth and power, and he wasn't an honest or faithful man, right? So they got some negative influences from Joe, but I think there's something from PJ that follows down that family bloodline, and you can't help but trace it back to Bridget as well, where the Kennedys, as we know them, the 20th century Kennedys, were raised with this recognition that they have a responsibility to serve, to help. And one way they took that on was to help those who were in need. And I think you can't help but trace that back to PJ, that he spent his whole life doing that. I found I got access to the PJ Kennedy papers at the JFK library. Many of these are letters that he wrote during his political career and for many years after. And all of them, almost all across the board, were him writing to somebody looking for help for somebody else. Like, hey, I learned about this kid in our neighborhood. He's trying to get to this school. Can we help him out? Can we write a letter of recommendation? Hey, somebody just came in off the boat. Can we find a job for them? So his whole career as a saloon keeper, as a politician, and as an influential kind of power broker later, it was all about helping others.
All right, so Neal, we'll get to some audience questions now. We have about 15 minutes. First question comes from Paul, who says, congratulations on the first Kennedys. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The research for this book was outstanding. How the Irish were treated during this era was terrible. Not the first ethnic group, nor the last to experience this. Nina, No Irish Need Apply, is something my grandmother spoke often about. Can you speak to your research for this book about No Irish Need Apply in particular? Good luck with this and future books. You have a new fan, Paul from Burlington. So talk a bit about No Irish Need Apply, Neal.
Yeah, will do. And thanks, Paul. And I've seen some of your comments elsewhere on social media, and I'm so glad you like the book. And thanks for reaching out, and thanks for joining tonight. It's great. No Irish Need Apply is another example of the kind of attitudes that Bridget and others faced when they got to this country. I found, they're sort of well known now, but I found newspaper articles that would say, looking for a maid, ideally some, English or Welsh or Scottish, absolutely no Irish need apply. And that attitude continued well deep into the 1800s. Even as Boston became more and more Irish, the attitude still was, I'd rather have, somebody other than a Bridget in my house. In time, they had no choice. They just had to end up hiring the Irish because there just weren't enough others to go around. But that attitude is fascinating, and it followed and haunted many of the young women who are coming here, like Bridget. So I'll pause there.
Sure. No, great. So Lindsay asks, and she asked this a little bit earlier on, so hopefully we filled in the blanks here. How do we get to our President JFK from Bridget Kennedy? And so I think Bridget had PJ, PJ had Joseph, and Joseph had JFK. Is that right, Neal? Did I get that right?
That's exactly right. Yep, that's the trajectory. But one thing I'll add to that is one of the things I explore, and I find it really interesting, is you've got PJ and his wife Mary, who are the parents of Joe, paternal grandparents of JFK and the rest. On the other side, you've got Honey Fitz, John F. Fitzgerald, and his wife, and their daughter Rose, who marries Joe. Honey Fitz and PJ were together part of that first wave of Irish Democratic politicians in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And the two of them served together, and sometimes at odds, for many years. So the dynamic between those two politicians, JFK's respective grandfathers on either side, I find it fascinating. And there are a bunch of interesting little tidbits throughout the book about the weird relationship between PJ and Honey Fitz.
DL asks, is there a connection between Patrick Kennedy owning a liquor stores and Joseph P. Kennedy being a bootlegger?
There is, but from what I've been able to find, Joe Kennedy was never actually a bootlegger. So his father, PJ, ran these liquor stores right up until Prohibition went into effect. I found a liquor license application in late 1919, like literally just weeks before Prohibition was going to become the law of the land, where PJ was still trying to keep his businesses afloat. When Prohibition became the law, it banned liquor sales, but not the possession of liquor. So PJ took all of his stuff from all of his liquor stores and his bars, with Joe's help, and put it in his basement at the house that he'd moved to in Winthrop. And then later, Joe would tap into that stash of liquor supplies from his dad. I don't know if he sold any. The evidence is that he probably used some of that to party, to bribe business colleagues, or just to give them away as gifts. But it doesn't seem as if he actually was an active bootlegger. He did get involved in the liquor business after Prohibition and was very successful at it, importing liquor to America once Prohibition ended. But the whole trajectory, I think, is fascinating. I didn't mention it earlier, but Bridget at her grocery store sold liquor. PJ is a hugely successful liquor man. Joe kind of picks up on it after that. So whiskey is like this through line through the first decades, almost the first century of the Kennedys in America.
So we have a question from Trenton who asks, how old would JFK be today? And so I don't know if there would be math. I don't know if you knew there would be math involved, Neal. I think according to a quick search engine search here, he'd be 104. He was born in 1917. So right. I would discount him possibly being alive, but then again, I think Jimmy Carter's pushing 100. So I guess you never know. But it
is amazing to make that comparison. Yeah. It's physically possible, yeah. But
yeah, JFK be 104 today. An anonymous attendee asked, did JFK and his siblings show their grandparents? I'm sorry, let me start over. Did JFK and his siblings know their grandparents, PJ and his wife? I'm wondering if PJ's model of service influenced his grandchildren, JFK and his siblings.
Oh, that's a good one. And I'm glad that came up. Thank you. Because yes, so JFK is born in, he's the second child born to Joe and Rose. First born was Joe Jr., 1915. JFK born in 1917. PJ lived until 1929. And during the 1920s, he was a doting grandfather. He loved visiting his grandkids. Joe was often in Hollywood, starting his film business. He was traveling a lot. Rose, was raising the kids primarily herself. So PJ and his wife, Mary, spent a lot of time with the kids, got to know JFK. JFK later described PJ, interestingly, as, kind of stern. He was not a goofy, playful guy, but he was definitely a devoted grandfather. And I'm sure his sort of focus on service and doing good for the community somehow filtered into those kids during that period of time when he was with them as the doting grandfather. Mary died a little bit earlier. She died in 1923, I think, and then PJ in 1929. So he knew JFK up until JFK was 12.
And I think the answer to this is no, because I think Bridget died in 1888, did we say? I could be mixing up my years. That 1888 seems like a big year for the Kennedy family. But Michelle asks, she's excited to pick up this book for a good read later. Sorry if this is answered in the book, but do you know if the JFK generation had any sense or interaction with their great-grandmother Bridget? Joe wanted to suppress his Irish heritage, but JFK, Teddy, and Robert didn't seem so alien to it.
Yeah, that's a good one too. So thank you. They didn't know their great grandmother Bridget, but they did, as we just discussed, know PJ and his wife Mary. And in JFK's case, he did visit Ireland a number of times, including months before he was killed. So he did have this sort of connection to Bridget and Patrick, his great grandparents, and where they came from. The only thing I'd say though about that is JFK, 1963, he's in New Ross, Ireland, and he gives a speech at the docks there and talks about his great grandfather, the barrel maker, but he never mentions Bridget, and that bums me out. So much of his life is due to her influence and her courage and her ability to keep the family alive after her husband Patrick is gone. I couldn't find any evidence of JFK or any other members of that family giving credit to Bridget, which is why this book exists. I think she's been overlooked and forgotten, and it's a shame.
So John asks, did Patrick and Bridget sail from Queenstown or Galway?
We talked earlier about the challenges of the research when you've got so many Bridget Murphys and Patrick Kennedys. So the short answer is we don't know. It's most likely that they sailed from where they were in County Wexford. I don't know where they left from, possibly from New Ross, right up the street from their farms, first to Liverpool. Many of the ships that came to Boston, in particular East Boston, went from Liverpool to East Boston. So many Irish went to Liverpool first, stayed there for a few days, treacherous, dangerous, disease-filled place, and then they caught their larger coffin ship from Liverpool to Boston or East Boston.
Let me put it, so we can't get enough Kennedys here in Tewksbury. We within the last couple of years, we did host Eileen McNamara for Eunice, the Kennedy who changed the world. We also had Kate Clifford Larson in for her book on Rosemary Kennedy. And so we'll end with this one. Janine wants to know, would you care to discuss Rosemary Kennedy, how she impacted her sister Eunice's desire to start the Special Olympics?
Yeah, I love Kate Clifford Lawson's book. And I think it's another example of not only how we can't get enough of the Kennedys, but how there are these interesting stories still there to be explored. I mean, a lot of people know Rosemary's story, but Kate just did a remarkable job really bringing her to life and showing what an influence she had on other members of that family. And I like this question because it means a lot to me personally. I mentioned earlier I had a sister who had Down syndrome. She's passed away now, but such a big influence on my life. and probably something that connected me without me realizing it to the Kennedys because of the creation of the Special Olympics. So I think Rosemary and Eunice are both examples of how the women in that family have had such an impact on this country and done such remarkable things, but are often, unfortunately, kind of overshadowed by the men. And so it's great to have books like Eunice and Rosemary, and hopefully this contributes to that trend of acknowledging the women in that family and what an important role they played in their own way. You know, obviously politics wasn't a path forward for some members of that family because women just weren't as involved in politics during, you know, the earlier decades of the 1900s, but each in their own way, they've found a way to be helpful, to give back. And I think Rosemary's influence on other members of that family, you see it not only in Eunice and her work with the Special Olympics, but I do think you see it in the men and sort of their sensitivity to certain issues and people who have special needs. It's not as overt as Eunice's specific, you know, focus on the Special Olympics, but I think that sensibility is there because of Rosemary's lasting influence on the family.
So Neal, we're approaching 8 o'clock. I'm going to say a couple of thank yous, and then I'm going to throw it back to you for any last words you may have. I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for sponsoring tonight's program. I want to thank Wellesley Books, who I think I neglected to mention at the beginning. They're our official bookstore partner, and you'll all be receiving an email from me tomorrow with a feedback survey, with the recording, and with a link to purchase an autographed copy of The First Kennedys from Wellesley Books. So look for that email tomorrow. And again, I want to thank the libraries in Clinton, Middleton, Lowell, Danvers, Tingsboro, Wilmington, Shrewsbury, Saugus, Georgetown, Pepperell, Medford, Groveland, Boxford, Littleton, and Raleigh for partnering with Tewksbury for tonight's event. So Neal, we have about 30 seconds. Do you have any last words for the audience?
Just a lot of thank yous. Robert, thank you for doing this. The questions were great. I've been doing a lot of this in recent weeks, and you guys like just came up with new things that I hadn't been asked before in a good way. I love being sort of pushed to think about this story in different ways. I also encourage you to pick up a copy of the book from any local independent bookseller. Wellesley has, as Robert said, the signed copies. I'm happy to send more signed copies if they run out, which would be a good problem to have. But just thank you for joining us tonight. As I said at the very start, I love you guys. I love libraries. I've spent my whole life in libraries, and you guys are heroes. If you're librarians out there, or anyone who just supports libraries. So thank you for the good work you do that allows me to do what I do and write the stories that I'm able to write. It wouldn't happen without libraries. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Neal. Thank you for your kind words about libraries. Best of luck with the rest of your virtual and in-person book tour. Best of luck with the book. And thank you for your kind words. I'm certainly no John Oliver, so I appreciate all the assistance. And I hope you have a great night. So thank you all so much. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here.